On the night of September 21st, 1588, a ship called La Trinidad Valenciera was breaking apart on the rocks of Canago Bay in County Donegal. Hundreds of men who had sailed with the Spanish Armada against England were now fighting the Atlantic itself and losing. Some drowned within sight of land. Some crawled onto the beach, half dead, coughing seawater, staring up at cliffs they did not recognize, in a country whose language they could not speak. Local Irish clans found them there, freezing, starving, and terrified, not knowing whether they had washed up among allies or executioners. That single night on that single beach became, over the following 4 centuries, the founding myth of an entire people. Somewhere in the tangled telling and retelling of what happened to those survivors, an explanation was born for one of the strangest and most striking faces in the British Isles, a face with jet black hair, skin so pale it looks lit from within, and eyes the color of shallow ocean water. For generations that face was called Black Irish. And for generations everyone assumed they knew exactly where it came from. They were wrong. And the moment scientists finally sequenced the bones buried in Irish soil, the shipwreck story, along with almost everything else people believed about this mystery, collapsed under the weight of the evidence. What replaced it is older, stranger, and far more dramatic than any legend about a wrecked fleet. Go to the west coast of Ireland today, to Kerry, to Cork, to the wild edges of Galway, and you will still see that face. It does not belong on the postcard version of Ireland that the world expects. The freckled redhead with the easy smile. This is something else entirely. Older, darker, colder in a way that seems to hold centuries in it. For as long as anyone can remember, people in those villages have noticed it, whispered about it in pubs, argued about it at wakes and weddings, and never once agreed on where it came from. The explanations people reached for were always dramatic. Spanish sailors, shipwrecked and stranded, Viking raiders who left more than just settlements behind, Norman knights who came, conquered, and never fully left. Every one of those stories had just enough plausibility to survive for another generation. None of them had enough evidence to actually hold up. And that gap between plausible story and provable fact is exactly where modern genetics stepped in, dug into the actual bones of Bronze Age Ireland, and pulled out an answer nobody was expecting. Start with the Armada theory, because it is the one that stuck hardest in the popular imagination. In 1588, King Philip II of Spain launched the most powerful naval fleet of its era against England, roughly 130 ships carrying tens of thousands of men. English naval tactics, and more decisively, brutal Atlantic storms tore that fleet apart. Somewhere between 20 and 30 Spanish ships wrecked along the Irish coastline that autumn, from Antrim in the north down to Kerry in the south, and thousands of sailors and soldiers died in the wrecks or were killed on shore in the chaotic weeks that followed. It is a genuinely dramatic piece of history full of desperation and cruelty and occasional acts of mercy from Irish clans who sheltered survivors at real risk to themselves. Somewhere in the folk memory of those events, the story shifted from history into genealogy. Dark-haired, olive-skinned survivors, so visibly different from the pale, fair Irish around them, married into local families, the legend says, and their children became the ancestors of the Black Irish. It is a beautiful story. It is also, according to every serious genetic study conducted on Irish populations, essentially invisible in the DNA. The math was always the real problem, long before anyone had a lab to prove it. Even generously estimating a few hundred Spanish survivors who settled permanently and had Irish children, that number is a rounding error against a national population that, by the late 16th century, likely exceeded 1 million people. A trickle that small simply cannot move the genetic needle of an entire nation, let alone explain a distinctive pigmentation pattern that shows up reliably across multiple counties. Romance was never the problem with this story. Scale was. The Viking theory holds up better, at least at first glance, because there is real measurable evidence behind it. Norse raiders began hitting Ireland's coasts in the closing years of the 8th century, and by the middle of the 9th century, they were not just raiding, they were settling, founding Dublin as a fortified trading base around 841 AD, along with Wexford, Waterford, Cork, and Limerick. Genetic surveys of modern Irish men do show a real, measurable signal of Scandinavian Y chromosome lineages, concentrated heavily in exactly the places you would expect, the eastern and southern coastal cities the Vikings actually built and lived in. That is a genuine, confirmed genetic legacy, not folklore. But it does not solve the Black Irish mystery because the geography is wrong. The Norse genetic signal clusters in Dublin, Waterford, Cork City, Limerick. The Black Irish look is strongest inland and westward, in Kerry and Connemara, in the remote parishes of Galway that Norse settlers barely touched. The Norman conquest of the 12th century leaves an even thinner trace, concentrated almost entirely among a handful of aristocratic Anglo-Norman surnames in the east, nowhere close to explaining a pigmentation pattern rooted in the rural West. Every medieval explanation, no matter how much real history sits behind it, keeps failing the same basic geography test. Whatever's happening to produce that face, it is not happening in the places medieval invaders actually settled. So the real answer requires abandoning the medieval timeline altogether and going back roughly 4,500 years to a Neolithic Ireland that most people have never even heard of, let alone learned about in school. Around 3500 BC, Ireland was home to farming communities descended from Mediterranean populations who had migrated north through Europe over thousands of years, bringing agriculture, permanent settlements, and eventually the extraordinary stone monuments that still stand today, the passage tombs of Newgrange, the megalithic complexes scattered across the island. This was a real, established, genetically distinct population with its own deep roots already sunk into Irish soil for 1,000 years or more. And then, starting around 2500 BC, something happened to them that archaeologists spent decades arguing about, and geneticists have now confirmed in devastating detail. People began arriving from continental Europe carrying a completely new material culture, distinctive bell-shaped pottery that gives the whole phenomenon its name, the bell beaker culture, along with early metalworking in copper and gold. So, for a long time, archaeologists assumed this was simple cultural diffusion, ideas and pottery styles spreading through trade and imitation without much actual movement of people. Then ancient DNA sequencing arrived, and the story fell apart completely. A landmark study published in Nature by a team led by Harvard's David Reich analyzed genome-wide data from 400 ancient individuals across Europe and found that the arrival of the beaker complex in Britain was accompanied by a population replacement so total it stunned the researchers themselves. Roughly 90% of the existing gene pool in Britain was replaced within a matter of centuries, and the changeover in Y chromosome lineages was even more extreme than that, with the previously dominant paternal haplogroup essentially disappearing and being overwhelmingly replaced by a lineage called R1b within just a few generations. David Reich told the BBC at the time that the magnitude and suddenness of the population replacement was, in his own words, highly unexpected. And that description barely captures how dramatic the shift really was. Ireland was not spared. If anything, the island became one of the clearest windows anywhere in Europe into exactly how complete this transformation was, because of what turned up on a small, windswept island off the coast of County Antrim called Rathlin. In 2016, a research team led by geneticist Laura Cassidy, working with Trinity College Dublin, sequenced the genomes of Bronze Age men buried on Rathlin Island roughly 4,000 years ago, alongside a Neolithic woman from Ballinahaddy who had died 1,000 years earlier. The contrast between those two sets of remains told the entire story of the Black Irish mystery in a single comparison. The Neolithic woman carried ancestry tracing directly back to early Mediterranean farmers, with no trace of the genetic markers that would define the population to come. The Bronze Age men from Rathlin were something almost entirely different. They carried substantial steppe ancestry, genetic heritage that had originated far to the east, in the grasslands north of the Black Sea, and traveled thousands of miles across the European continent before washing up, quite literally on the northeastern shore of Ireland. All three Rathlin men belonged to Y chromosome haplogroup R1b, and more specifically, to a branch called R1bL21, the exact same paternal lineage that today is carried by well over 80% of Irish men, and which reaches close to its highest frequency anywhere on Earth in the far west of the country. Those bones on Rathlin Island were not ancient strangers passing through. They were, in the most literal genetic sense, the direct paternal ancestors of the population that exists in Ireland right now. What arrived with those Bronze Age migrants was not just a new Y chromosome lineage, it was an entire package of biological traits that would go on to define the modern Irish population. They carried the genetic variant for lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk into adulthood, a trait that would have been rare or absent in earlier farming populations, and that spread so thoroughly through Ireland over the following millennia that the country today has one of the highest frequencies of lactase persistence anywhere on the planet, a direct legacy of a dairy-based economy that took root in the Bronze Age and never let go. They also carried the same Cassidy study identified something even more startling buried in that ancient DNA, the C282Y mutation responsible for hereditary hemochromatosis, a condition where the body absorbs and stores dangerous amounts of iron. It remains, to this day, disproportionately common in people of Irish descent, so much so that it is sometimes nicknamed the Celtic curse, and its presence in a 4,000-year-old genome marked, according to the researchers, the first time a known disease-causing mutation had ever been directly detected in a prehistoric human genome. The Bronze Age newcomers also carried genetic variants linked to lighter eye color, and those spread rapidly through the population over subsequent centuries. But here's the detail that almost nobody talks about, and it is the detail that actually explains the Black Irish face. The genetic variants for dark hair did not vanish. They persisted, generation after generation, in certain lineages, in certain communities, quietly refusing to disappear even as lighter traits spread around them. To understand why those dark-haired lineages survived at all, you have to look past the fathers and toward the mothers. Because Y, chromosome DNA, and mitochondrial DNA tell two very different stories about the same population. Mitochondrial DNA passes exclusively from mother to child, essentially unchanged for many generations unless a mutation occurs, which makes it one of the most stable and reliable records available in human genetics. And when researchers examined the maternal lineages carried by modern Irish women, what they found was a story of remarkable continuity rather than sudden replacement. The single most common maternal haplogroup in Ireland today is haplogroup H, carried by roughly a third or more of Irish women, with particularly strong concentrations in the subgroups H1 and H3, lineages that trace back to early European farmers and to the Bronze Age migrants who arrived alongside them. But alongside that dominant lineage survives something much older. A meaningful minority of Irish women carry haplogroup U, one of the oldest maternal lineages known in the whole of Europe, and within it a branch called U5, a lineage connecting living Irish women today directly back to the hunter-gatherer populations, who walked onto the island in the millennia after the last ice age retreated, more than 7,000 years ago, long before farming, long before metalworking, long before the Beaker migrations ever began. Their mitochondrial DNA is still circulating through Irish families today, essentially unbroken across 7,000 years. And crucially, many of these ancient maternal lineages show their closest genetic relatives not in Britain, but along the wider Atlantic seaboard, in France, in Iberia, tracing old maritime and coastal connections that predate any Viking longship by thousands of years. Some of those maternal lineages appear to have carried pigmentation variants that helped keep dark hair alive in the population even as the wave of lighter traits spread outward from the Bronze Age arrivals. The fathers brought transformation. The mothers preserved what came before. Together, over 4,000 years, they produced the exact genetic range that makes a face like the Black Irish possible in the first place. If you want to actually see where that ancient inheritance survived most intact, you go west, and modern genetics has now confirmed exactly why. In 2017, the Irish DNA Atlas Project, a collaboration between the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and Trinity College Dublin, analyzed the genomes of individuals whose grandparents had all come from the same small geographic area, essentially reconstructing a genetic map of Ireland as it existed before the 20th century scrambled everything through migration and mobility. What the researchers found dismantled, once and for all, the comfortable assumption that Ireland has ever been one single homogeneous population. Instead, the island broke apart into 10 genetically distinct clusters, the clusters showing the strongest continuity with ancient Bronze Age Ireland, the ones least diluted by later Viking, Norman, or English settlement, were concentrated overwhelmingly in the west, in Kerry and Connemara, in the more isolated parishes of Munster and Connaught. While most of the rest of Ireland carries a measurable trace of Scandinavian-related ancestry from centuries of Viking presence, those western clusters carry significantly less, sometimes barely any at all. Later arrivals, whether Norse, Norman, or English, simply never fully penetrated those communities the way they reshaped the East Coast. That kind of isolation does something very specific and very predictable to a small population's gene pool, something population geneticists call the founder effect. When a population stays relatively cut off from outside genetic influence across enough generations, rare traits do not just survive by chance, they concentrate, becoming steadily more common within that closed community precisely because there is nothing diluting them. The unusual combination of very dark hair alongside pale skin and light-colored eyes had, in the isolated west of Ireland, exactly the closed genetic environment it needed to become a stable, recurring feature of entire communities rather than a rare individual anomaly. Culture reinforced what geography had already protected. The West was also the historic stronghold of the Irish language, of traditional music, of tightly knit communities that tended to marry within their own local networks across many generations, and cultural insularity and genetic insularity reinforced each other for a very long time. What you are looking at when you see that face in the west of Ireland is not a strange exception to the Irish genetic record. It is the oldest continuously preserved genetic legacy that survives anywhere on the island. The actual biological mechanism behind all of this comes down to a single gene that geneticists have studied intensively, called MC1R, the melanocortin-1 receptor, which acts as the primary switch controlling pigmentation of skin and hair in humans. Ireland has one of the most unusual relationships with this gene of any population on the planet. Specific MC1R variants, including mutations identified by researchers as R151C, R160W, and D294H, each independently raise the likelihood of red hair and freckling, and Ireland carries the highest concentration of these particular variants found anywhere in the world, which is exactly why roughly 10% of the Irish population has naturally red hair, against a global average that sits well below 2%. That statistic is genuinely real and genuinely extraordinary. But this is precisely where the popular understanding of Irish genetics falls apart, because carrying one of these red hair variants does not automatically guarantee red hair at all. Pigmentation in humans is not a single simple switch. It functions more like an ongoing tug of war between competing genetic systems. On one side sit the genes responsible for melanin production, pushing hair color toward dark. On the other side sit the MC1R mutations, weakening that melanin signal and pushing toward red and lighter shades. Whichever system wins that particular contest in a given individual determines what color hair actually grows on their head, and it is entirely possible, and in fact common, for someone to carry a red hair variant and still end up with jet black hair simply because their melanin production genes were strong enough to override it. This plays out constantly within Irish families. Siblings with hair the color of flame sitting beside siblings with hair the color of midnight, born to the same two parents, drawing from the exact same gene pool, with the outcome decided by which side won that particular genetic contest in that particular child. The dark pigmentation alleles driving the midnight-haired outcome are not some rare foreign import. Ancient DNA studies confirm they were already present in Ireland during the Neolithic period, carried by the Mediterranean farming populations who had settled the island thousands of years before the Bronze Age beaker migrations ever introduced lighter traits into the mix. Those two genetic systems met on Irish soil, competed against each other for 4,000 years, and never fully resolved in either direction. The black Irish face is not evidence of some foreign bloodline arriving from outside. It is what happens when ancient Irish genetics simply refuses to lose. Surnames carry this history too, in ways most people never stop to consider, because an Irish surname can function almost like a biological record passed alongside the DNA itself. Take the Uí Néill dynasty, one of the most powerful ruling families in early medieval Ireland, claiming descent from the legendary Niall of the Nine Hostages and dominating large stretches of the north and northwest of the country for centuries through the early Middle Ages. Genetic studies examining Y chromosome lineages across modern Ireland have found that a striking proportion of men in the northwest of the country, men bearing surnames long associated with descent from that dynasty, share a specific branch of the very same R1b L21 haplogroup traced back through the Rathlin Island remains, a single dominant genetic signal still clearly visible across an entire region more than 1,000 years after that dynasty's political power faded. And that region sits squarely within the same northwestern and western geography most consistently associated with the Black Irish appearance. Dynastic power is only part of that story, though, because tragedy carved its own deep mark into the same genetic landscape. The Great Famine, beginning in 1845 and lasting through 1852, collapsed Ireland's population from roughly 8 million people to closer to 4 million within less than a decade, through a combination of mass starvation, disease, and an enormous wave of immigration that permanently emptied entire townlands and parishes. The genetic consequence of losing half a population in less than 10 years is brutally simple. When that many people disappear from a community all at once, the genetic makeup of whoever remains gets effectively amplified within the surviving population, and traits that might otherwise have stayed rare and scattered instead become defining features of the community left behind. In the already isolated west of Ireland, where generations of relative genetic seclusion had already concentrated the unusual pigmentation combination behind the Black Irish look, the famine acted almost like a final filter, further sharpening a pattern that geography and culture had already been building for thousands of years. The most comprehensive confirmation of this entire picture did not come from any single dramatic discovery, but from the slow accumulation of genome-wide autosomal DNA studies across large Irish population samples, measured carefully against the broader ancient European genetic record. What emerged was remarkably precise. Modern Irish ancestry breaks down into 3 distinct ancient genetic streams that have remained in a relatively stable balance for roughly 4,000 years. Approximately 1/3 traces back to Western hunter-gatherer populations who resettled the island in the millennia after the retreat of the ice sheets. Another substantial third or more traces back to early Mediterranean farmers who carried agriculture, livestock, and crucially, those persistent dark pigmentation alleles up through Europe and eventually onto Irish soil. The remaining portion arrived with the steppe pastoralists, whose Bronze Age migration, funneled through the bell-beaker culture, reshaped not just Ireland, but the entire European continent within the span of a few centuries. That 3-way genetic balance has held remarkably steady on the island for nearly 4,000 years, a degree of long-term continuity that very few other populations anywhere in Europe can honestly claim. Later, historical arrivals left their marks, but never evenly across the island. Viking genetic influence concentrated tightly in the eastern coastal cities they actually founded and ruled. Norman genetic signatures appear almost exclusively among a small cluster of aristocratic eastern lineages descended from 12th century conquest. Later plantation settlement in the 17th century left its clearest genetic imprint across the north. The west of Ireland absorbed almost none of any of it, remaining, generation after generation, closer to its own Bronze Age ancestors than to its own neighbors on the eastern half of the same small island. What modern genomics ultimately confirmed was exactly what the landscape, the isolation, and generations of oral tradition had always quietly suggested, long before anyone had the tools to prove it scientifically. The western counties of Ireland were never fully overwritten by any of the later waves of settlement and invasion that reshaped so much of the rest of the island. The oldest genetic layer in Irish history survived there essentially intact, and the Black Irish face still looking back from those Atlantic communities today is not some unexplained mystery in need of a dramatic new theory. It is simply, and quite literally, the oldest face in Ireland, still recognizable after roughly 4,000 years of continuous descent. That face on the west coast of Ireland was never an anomaly, never a genetic accident, and never the lingering trace of some shipwreck or raid that happened to leave a scattering of foreign genes behind. It represents the most direct living connection surviving anywhere in Ireland to the people who first raised the island's stone monuments, who lived through the sweeping Bronze Age transformation that replaced the vast majority of their neighbors' ancestry within a matter of centuries, who held their own lineages together through isolation, through famine, through every historical upheaval that swept across a small island sitting on the edge of the Atlantic world. The old myths were always going to feel more comfortable than the actual truth, because Spanish sailors make for a far better fireside story than 4,000 years of unbroken and largely uneventful genetic continuity. Viking raiders make for a much more dramatic explanation than the quiet, stubborn persistence of Neolithic pigmentation genes sitting inside communities that simply never got diluted quite enough to lose them entirely. Those romantic explanations survived for so long mainly because nobody had actually read the bones carefully enough to replace them with something better. Now the bones have been read, sequenced, and cross-checked against thousands of other ancient and modern genomes across Europe. And what they say turns out not to be complicated at all. The Black Irish were never foreign. They were never some genuinely mysterious bloodline. They were never the product of an outside force passing briefly through Ireland and leaving a permanent mark on its way out. They are, in the most literal sense modern science can offer, the original face of the island, preserved for 4,000 years in the West by a specific combination of geography, culture, and the sheer ruthlessness of what it took to survive there. Identity, it turns out, is rarely as simple as any stereotype insists it should be. The same island that gave the world its famous red hair was quietly keeping something even older underneath the surface the entire time. It was always there, waiting in the bones and the bloodlines of the West. It simply took science long enough to finally catch up and confirm what those Atlantic communities never actually forgot about themselves.